Bom dia, gente! Começando as programações da nossa Semana das Letras. Nessa quarta-feira, a gente vai iniciar as palestras com a Talita Paiva. Muito obrigada, Talita. Só alguns recados. Eu vou enviar a lista de presença pelo chat da live mesmo. E aí vocês preenchem certinho e ela vai ficar disponível até 10 minutos depois da apresentação. Vocês podem mandar perguntas pelo chat também, de preferência uns 10 minutinhos antes de finalizar a apresentação. E é isso, pode começar, Talita.
Obrigada, Júlia. Vou fazer minha apresentação em inglês. Então agora eu vou mudar para o inglês, ok? So, I'm a graduate student at XII under the supervision of Professor Luis Fernando Sá, and I work with 4 novels by Salman Rushdie. Midnight's Children is one of them, okay? And today I'm going to talk about identity and storytelling in Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, okay? So just a brief summary before we start. The novel was first published in 1981, and it tells the story about Salim Sinai. And he is the narrator, the first person narrator of the story. And he starts his story telling how his grandfather met his grandmother, so Adam Aziz and Nazim Ghani. That is also called by the nickname of Reverend Mother, okay? And then this story starts in 1915, okay? Then the story progresses to Salim's parents, Mustaz Aziz, that is later renamed for Amina Sinai when she gets married to Ahmed Sinai. And this story happens about 1942. And then the story progresses until the birth of Salim Sinai in 1947. And this date is very important in the story because it's also the date of India's Independence Day, okay? Salim Sinai is born together with his country, as a political country. And it happens on August 15, 1947 at exact midnight. So that's why the novel is called Midnight's Children. And he tells about his story, his family story, but also the story of his country. And in the way, when he is about 10 years old, he also meets other Midnight's Children, okay? So he also includes these stories in his narrative. And he starts writing his memoir, the story itself, about 1978 when he is 30 years old, okay? Okay, so first I will speak a little bit about storytelling. Walter Benjamin says that people, a long time ago when there wasn't written forms of communication and orality was more prominent, people used stories to transmit knowledge to young generations. Historical events or sometimes practical information that people should know about the geography of the place they lived, or about the habits of the community, things that were important to them, okay, their traditions and culture. And also to warn listeners of possible dangers, okay, so stories were used to inform and to warn people. Stories were principally based on a person's life. So it was a story, based on the narrator's life, but sometimes it could also be based on other people that lived with him, stories that he heard. So it contained basically personal and collective memory of the community. In oral transmissions, listeners can become storytellers themselves because when they listen to stories, they can reproduce the stories and tell to other people. And in this reproduction, in this transmission, sometimes details of the stories may change. And there is a variety of versions. Okay, it's easier to have a lot of versions when you are in an oral culture. Okay, because each person will tell the story in a different way. The main characteristics of storytelling, I'm thinking about oral storytelling, are mnemonic devices like alliterations, assonance, antithesis, and pattern themes and characters. These repetitions of sounds or this use of opposites or patterned characters help people remember the stories. Remember that there is no written form, so people need to find ways to memorize the stories. All the stories were memorized, all the information needed to be memorized, so you could pass to other people. And these devices help the people, remember the stories and the details. Something else that is used a lot in storytelling, in oral storytelling, is epithets, that are adjectives that characterize a certain person, or a group of people. So the evil witch, for example, or the beautiful queen or the beautiful princess, words that always go together, adjectives and nouns that go together. And then it becomes easier, for people to understand and reproduce the stories later. There is also word and phrase repetition. Okay, so in Rushdie, for example, there are some parts of stories that he used the same word more than once because he reproduces this style, this oral storytelling style. In oral culture, the speaker and the audience share the same space. So he tells a story to people that are there with him and they can respond to the story immediately. So this is a big difference between what we have today when we read a novel, and we don't have the author present, we cannot discuss with him, but it can happen in oral performances, okay? The audience can respond positively or not to the speaker, to the narrator. And these performances can be accompanied with the narrator's facial expressions, body movements, with songs and dance. So it's a more theatrical performance than the quiet, and private act of reading a novel. Francesca Coletta and her colleagues affirms that as social performances, stories are subject to, here I quote, hierarchies of cultural authority that have shaped the credibility of particular stories. End of quote. What they say is that stories are important to vehicle of communication, but we need to understand that there is a hierarchy of authority. That some people, because of their position, will not reach as many people as others. So there are dominant narratives that undermine minor narratives or the narratives of minority groups or people that are not in power. So the position of a person who speaks is important. Okay, where she speaks from, who is this person? All of these things will guarantee more credibility to his or her narrative. Because of that, the critical race theory coined a term called counter storytelling. It is about, it's a way of giving a counter response, a response to the dominant narrative, okay? This term is usually associated with to critical race theories that aim at understanding how mainstream stories portray Americans' views about race and why those stories are still prominent. This line of research wants to know how people can portray themselves in their own stories, how they can provide counter narratives to this mainstream story that defines them. It's usually critical race theory is about Black people in America, but we can use the same idea to other kinds of studies of minority groups. And I use this term in my research to talk about post-colonial literature. That's where Salman Rushdie is inserted and his novels are inserted. So in post-colonial literature, counter-storytelling has produced a response to the monological discourse about the colonial subjects while proposing new ways to imagine the ex-colonies as independent countries. Counter-storytelling is important because of this response, because you're giving an alternative, open up possibilities of seeing the ex-colonies. But it is also important because it shows different ways of living inside the country. So it's not just giving one alternative to the dominant discourse, but producing as many possibilities as possible. Because when you have this multiplicity of stories, multiplicity of responses, you can include more people, more kinds of people from different genders, people from different economic backgrounds, people from different political affiliations. So that's something very important here. And in Midnight Children, we see that although there is a narrator and he tells his story, inside his stories there are minor stories. There are other stories that are related to Salman, and he tells his stories to show the multiplicity and the plurality of culture, language, political affiliation, and economic background of the people in India. So to talk about national identities, I work with 3 definitions of nation. The first one is given by Ernest Renan, and he says that sharing, here I quote, a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion, end of quote, unifies the nation more effectively than any geographical delimitation. So his nation is not only about geography, it's not only about this territorial limitation, okay? For him, it is about having a memory of a past, okay? So people that live together and they share this long past, of memory and history. And then after some time, Benedict Anderson takes this idea and coins the concept of imagined community, okay? And it's about nations, that are formed by different groups of people that share a sense of belonging together. So it's not only geography, it's not only the memory of a past, but there is this agreement of living together and belonging together as a group. But these classical definitions of a nation do not encompass people that have, crosses the line of the boundary, the country. So if you're talking about immigration, diaspora, or other cultural encounters. So Florian Kuhlmann takes this idea of imagined community and proposes that people who share, here I quote, culture, customs, and above all, language, end of quote, also constitute a nation. And then he can imagine the concept of a nation and include the concept of nation people that do not live in their country, live in other places in the world, okay? So it's not only about history, about sharing the memory. It's not only about the sense of belonging together, okay? But sharing other things like culture, customs, traditions, languages, so everything should be considered when you define the nation. Because of that, one fixed definition of a national identity may reinforce stereotypes and give the wrong impression that people share the same characteristics just because they were born in or descend from the same country. So it's not because you belong to the same territory, you have the same nationality, that you like the same things, that you have the same religion, that you speak the same language. We need to see that there is diversity inside the nation, and that's what post-colonial literature wants to show, okay? This diversity, this plurality. By showing representations of the nation within the limits of time and place, post-colonial novels such as Midnight's Children bring forward the effects of history in the construction of national identities. So we see in Midnight's Children how Salim Sinai is linked to the nation and how events in the nation interferes in his life and how he, as a citizen, can interfere in the national sphere. Here's a quote from His Night's Children. It is part of the letter that Salim Sinai received from the Prime Minister on his birth. So here is I quote, "Dear baby Salim, you are the newest bearer of that ancient face of India, which is also eternally young. We shall be watching over your life with the closest attention. It will be, in a sense, the mirror of our own." End of quote. So here we see how, since the beginning of his life, Salim is connected to his country. He mirrors the country. Okay, so what happens to the country happens to him, in a sense. And we see that although India has a long history, and long years of language, different languages and cultures, it was on that night, on the Independence Day, that it was reborn. Okay, so Salim grows up with his country, and we see how, in the novel, how it is developed. Because after independence, the country had to negotiate some things, and there were a lot of demonstrations. People were vindicated their rights, their position. There were conflicts between people from different language and religion. So Midnight's Children shows that there is no that the country is not homogeneous, okay, and how the country was negotiating that identity, the transformation into a country in a political, entity, and how people were living together at that time, and how they negotiated their identity as a community, as a group. So Salim tells a story about his country, but he also tells his life story. So it is his autobiography. And he decides to write an autobiography because he is, here quote, literally disintegrating slowly for the moment, although there are signs of acceleration, end of quote. So there are cracks in his skins, and they are becoming wider and wider. So that's why he said that he is disintegrating. And it's interesting to see that as he tells his story, the cracks are becoming larger. As it, I think it's a metaphor for the idea that he has filled himself with stories of other people, stories of his country. And as he tells the story, he cleanses himself from the burden of carrying so many stories, so much history of his country. Nicole Thier has observed that there is an excessive number of minor stories that converge into the main storyline, endowing Salim's autobiography with a sense of community and integration. So do you remember the idea of imagined community? It is portrayed in Midnight's Children through these minor stories, because Salim does not just tell only his story, he tells the story of other people, his neighbors, his family members, people that grew up with him, his colleagues at school, other midnight children. So this gives a sense of community. He is telling the story of his imagined community, people that are living together, agreed to live together because they belong to the same nation. Here's another quote from Midnight Children related to Salim's identification with his people and how he represents his people. So here I quote, I no longer wanted to be anything except who I am. What I am. Maestro, I am the sum total of everything that went before me, of all I have been seen done, of everything done to me. I am everyone, everything whose being in the world was affected by mine. End of quote. So here we see that for Salim, he is a representation of his country, and everything that came before him is part of his life, is part of his story. Everything that he has seen, every person in his life is connected to him and has affected how he lived his life. And he has also affected these people's lives. Salim wants to be eternalized in his narrative. That's why he writes. Okay. So he dedicates his, here I quote, time at the great work of preserving memory as well as fruit is being saved from the corruption of the clocks, end of quote. Salim works in a picture factory, and then they preserve fruits and vegetables there, and he uses 30 jars, 30 pickle jars to represent each chapter of his narrative. So there is the same number of pickle jars and chapters, but the last one, the 31 pickle jar, is left empty because each represents the future. Each represents his hope for the future and the stories that are to come. Okay, so he preserved the story up to his 30th year, but there is more. Okay, and this empty pickle jar represents that. Okay, the future of his life and his country and the next generation. Salim's narrative is not intended to be accurate. Thus, minor mistakes such as dates or great changes as the aftermath of his rival do not interfere with the core of the narrative. It's important to remember that it's his autobiography, and as he is told in the first person perspective, it's not a reliable story. And it's funny because he understands that, and he comments on the changes. So he tells the reader a story about Shiva, that is his rival. He is also a Midnight child, who Salim does not like very much, and he creates a terrible end for him, a terrible aftermath. But at the end, he says, reader, everything that I have told is not true. I created it. I made up everything. And he does that with this part, and he also does that with Mahatma Gandhi's death. So in the story, it is in the wrong date. And when Salim sees the mistake, he says, in my narrative, Mahatma Gandhi is going to die in the wrong date, and there is no problem. Okay, so his story does not need to be accurate. It's just his version of his story is how he sees the events, how his memory has organized his life events. Is his perspective of the story. So that's why counter narratives are so important. It gives one person's version of the story. So we should have a lot of versions. So we have a better idea if we have a lot of options, a lot of possibilities. So here's another quote from Midnight Children. Okay, here a quote. I reached the end of my long-winded autobiography in words and pickles. I have immortalized my memories, although distortions are inevitable in both methods. We must live, I'm afraid, with the shadows of imperfection. End of quote. So Salim is also calling attention to the fictionality of his narrative and how it is a production of his memories, and therefore it might be distortions, it might be parts of it that are products of a bad memory or part of it that is fictionalized. So that is what his autobiography is about. It's just a version of the events, his version of the events. So that's an important characteristic of his narrative. It gives him the opportunity to tell the events from his perspective. And for himself, it becomes the most important version of the story. Okay. Salim has an immediate audience. Her name is Padma. She is a different kind of listener. If we think about the relationship between author and reader, because as Salim is reading to her, she can talk to him and give him her ideas. Okay, so she is a very opinionative listener. So she's not a passive listener because she guides Salim so that his story becomes as organized as she thinks it should be. She is the one that is constantly reminding Salim that he needs to tell his story. He's taking too long to get to his birth, and this kind of comment. And it's interesting because she does not have education. Okay? She is illiterate. She doesn't know how to read. And her story is told through Salim's narrative. Okay? It is inserted in his narrative. And we see that there is no disposition on the part of Salim to teach her to read and to write so that she can tell her own story. And it is important, this relationship between them is important because it shows the differences. What I said before about the dominant narrative and the other counter narratives, we also have differences inside the country because there are people that belong to lower classes that do not have the same position and the same opportunity to tell their stories. Okay. And this relationship between Padma and Salim as audience and author mirrors the historical relationship between high and the low classes in the colony. Okay, so we should have more ways, more opportunities, a better platform for the lower classes so they could tell their own stories. Because although Salim's narrative is important in relation to the empire, because it gives a counter narrative to the empire, and it somehow deconstructs the ideas that Europe might have about Indians, it does not encompass everybody in the nation. So although it tells a story about Padma, it does not have her eye, does not have her voice inside it, okay? It is mirrored, it is mediated by Salim's words and Salim's narrative, okay? But this passage in which the passages in which Padma interrupts Salim hit at a movement toward change. It's an attempt to reach a location where Padma and the lower classes she represents will be able to speak directly to their own audience. We have seen that it has changed, and nowadays it's easier because we have social medias and we have better ways, open ways, so people can portray their stories and they can speak for themselves if they do not have a higher position in society. Okay, we can see this change. So my conclusion for this chapter is that storytelling enables Salim to reconnect to his heritage and to ponder on his role in his family and society. His narrative also represents a country that is going through the process of redefining its national identities after independence. So it's important to highlight that this redefinition or reconstruction of national identity is not a process that ends. Okay, it goes on and on, because people change, the country changes, there are other factors that change the history of the country. So personal, collective, and national identities are in constant change. Salim takes a long time to understand that he does not need to, here quote, bear the burden of history, end of quote, by himself, or become what he is expected to be. Other people's expectations do not affect Salim anymore. In fact, the story he imprints on paper becomes the ultimate version of his life journey. Thanks a lot for hearing me. I'm open for the questions if you do have any questions.
Muito obrigada, Talita. O
De
pessoal
nada,
pode
Júlia.
mandar as perguntas pelo chat. E que interessante, achei muito interessante como ele trata dessa distorção e ele verbaliza isso e assume isso na autobiografia. Muito denso também.
É,
E aí, se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta, podem mandar no chat, por favor. Lembrando que a lista de presença só vai ficar disponível até 10 minutos depois da apresentação. Alexandre Carvalho. O que motivou sua pesquisa, Talita?
eu tive a ideia de fazer essa pesquisa quando eu li um dos livros do Salman Rushdie, O Heron and the Sea of Sorry. Então, tudo começou ali. Essa história ele escreveu para contar um pouco da situação dele depois que ele sofreu, né, uma perseguição por parte de algumas pessoas no islamismo por causa The Satanic Verses, né, os versos satânicos. E aí ele conta uma história para o filho dele, da importância de se contar histórias, da importância de ter ficção, né? Qual a importância dessa história que não é verdadeira, né? Então, nessa novela, porque ele é bem curtinho, ele fala disso e ele mostra, né, nesse mundo ficcional, como as pessoas têm tantas coisas em comum, mas se apegam tanto na diferença, né? E aí, a partir desse livro, eu fui procurar em outros livros do Salman Rushdie o que tinha a ver com storytelling, o que tinha a ver com essa questão da identidade, principalmente da identidade nacional. E eu achei mais outros três romances que lidavam com as mesmas coisas e que tinham também essa perspectiva, né, de tratar a identidade tanto pessoal quanto coletiva e nacional em relação ao storytelling, né, a importância de contar a história, né, de ter a própria pessoa contando a sua própria história.
Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? O Alexandre elogiou o tema, bastante denso, ótima escolha, adorou a apresentação, sucesso.
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada, Alexandre.
Então, acho que é isso, gente. Vou ter que encerrar porque já tem outra apresentação daqui a pouco, mas muito obrigada, Talita. Foi sensacional.
Muito obrigada.
E é isso, pessoal. Aguardo vocês nas próximas palestras também. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, gente.